I'm Catherine Spencer-Ross, and I'm president of Heritage Ottawa. It's with great pleasure that I welcome you to our celebration of Heritage Week, which Heritage Ottawa marks with its annual Phillips Memorial Lecture. The last time we had an in-person February lecture was 2020, so it's delightful to see so many of you here. This annual event was inaugurated in 2006 and is dedicated to the founders more than 55 years ago of the organization that became Heritage Ottawa. Indeed, it can be said without exaggeration that Bob and Marianne Phillips, and I'm not sure if they're photos, there they are, whose photos you can see on the screen, were the founders of built heritage consciousness and advocacy in Ottawa. In 1967, during Canada's centenary, the Phillipses created an advocacy group called A Capital for Canadians. Its Heritage Committee was the beginning of Heritage Ottawa, which was incorporated in 1974. Bob Phillips was its first president and later became the first executive director of the Heritage Canada Foundation, now the National Trust for Canada. In the 1960s and 70s, with these organizations and a tremendous personal commitment, Bob and Marianne undertook information campaigns and public activism to save key historic buildings and structures in Ottawa that were under threat. Structures as diverse as the Billings House, Pretoria Bridge, Union Station, and yes, even the East Block of Parliament Hill. Given their vision and success with advocating for the preservation of some of Ottawa's most iconic buildings, I think Bob and Marianne would approve of our subject for this evening, a thought borne out by their daughters, two of whom are here with us tonight, right there. Thank you. To you, Jennifer and Margaret, I say welcome once again to the annual lecture that celebrates your parents and honors the strength of heritage consciousness in Ottawa and the National Capital Region, to which Bob and Marianne devoted so much time, energy, and effort. Before moving forward with tonight's presentation, I would like to acknowledge that Ottawa is at the heart of a vast homeland whose history reaches long back before the era that we will feature this evening. For hundreds of years, Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples have been pressing for their Indigenous rights to be respected and their history to be understood. Heritage Ottawa, together with our partners this evening, make efforts to bring awareness to Algonquin history and heritage through programs, partnerships, and teaching. Heritage Ottawa is pleased to present this evening about 24 Sussex in partnership with Carleton University's School of Indigenous and Canadian Studies and the Israeli School of Architecture and Urbanism, and with Historic Ottawa Development, Inc. We are particularly delighted to be able to come together in this splendid space in the Carleton Dominion-Chalmers Centre. My heartfelt thanks to Carleton University for its generosity. For over a decade, we at Heritage Ottawa have been considering interesting ways to have a public discourse about 24 Sussex. So we are delighted that we are finally have that conversation this evening. To that end, I would like to thank our speakers, Marc Thompson-Brand of Trace Architects, Inc., the Honourable Sheila Copps, who I hope is joining us virtually, there she is, Marc Denhez, President of Historic Ottawa Development, Inc., and Dr. Patricia Kell, Executive Director of the National Trust for Canada. And it is with many thanks that I acknowledge our moderator, Andrew Cohen. I also wish to thank Liette Fortin, adjunct professor in Carleton's Heritage Conservation and Sustainability Studio at the Israeli School of Architecture, for her leadership and guidance of 7 students who prepared concepts for the rehabilitation of 24 Sussex. One of our speakers, Marc Brandt, has also shared his vision of a potential future state for 24 Sussex while achieving net zero carbon emissions and meeting the national conservation standards and guidelines. If you have not already seen these panels, I encourage you to visit the Woodside Hall before you leave this evening. An event of this nature does not happen without many sets of hands. So I thank all the volunteers from Carleton and Heritage Ottawa who have brought this evening to fruition. Finally, Heritage Ottawa's lecture series is made possible through the generosity of our sponsor, Andrex Holding Inc. and Sandy Smallwood. Sandy has been a faithful sponsor of these lectures and other Heritage Ottawa events and activities. We're also grateful for an operations grant from the City of Ottawa and a heritage grant from the Province of Ontario. For tonight's lecture, I particularly thank David Carment, Director of Carleton University School of Indigenous and Canadian Studies, for being central to the planning for this evening and for his centre's significant financial contribution. And now to the subject at hand. Heritage Ottawa has been watching 24 Sussex Drive for years. We have written about 24 Sussex and advocated for its conservation. By 2019, it was evident the Government of Canada was not close to making a decision on funding its upkeep or its future. So, in February of that year, we wrote to Prime Minister Trudeau. We pointed out that 24 Sussex is not just any home, but the official residence of the Prime Minister of Canada, and a nationally significant place that belongs to all Canadians. It forms part of a suite of Confederation-era buildings designed in the Gothic Revival style. 24 Sussex, along with Earnscliffe and the Parliament buildings themselves, are all part of an elegant landscape of structures located on one of the most dramatic and iconic landscapes in Canada that speaks to the creation of our country. It has been the home of politicians since it was built, and the official residence of our prime ministers since Louis Saint-Laurent, with the exception of Kim Campbell and, of course, the current prime minister. It has, consequentially, been the setting for many important political events. For these reasons, 24 Sussex is a classified federal heritage building. It is tragic that the building has been allowed to deteriorate. So where do we stand today? The National Capital Commission has recently undertaken necessary remediation on the building, conserving some important aspects of its interior. It now behooves our national government to acknowledge this House as the official residence of a democratically elected Prime Minister. Prime Ministers are not the owners, but the stewards of this significant building. The House and its iconic landscape belong to all Canadians. 24 Sussex does not recognize political stripes. What it needs now is an imaginative rehabilitation to reflect the requirements of its official function in the 21st century, be that as an official residence or another official purpose, while preserving its history and heritage. I'm itching to get on with our conversation, as I'm sure you are, so I will therefore turn over the floor to David Carment, Director of Carleton School of Indigenous and Canadian Studies, who will outline the format for this evening and introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, for those excellent comments regarding the effort put on by Heritage Ottawa, Historic Ottawa Development Corporation, and the School of Canadian Studies at Carleton University. None of this could be possible without the team that has been working assiduously for the last 3 months, I guess, or more, and our deepest thanks to those who have contributed to organizing this event. So when I was recently appointed Director of the School of Canadian Studies, I was pleased to learn that Carleton was one of the first universities in the country to establish a Canadian Studies program. We are the only university in Canada to have a standalone PhD in Canadian Studies. Today, Carleton is recognized in the national capital and beyond for expertise and leadership in this important field of study. In our diverse interdisciplinary program, students learn to think about Canada from different viewpoints, and in the process become skilled at combining the methods and perspectives of different disciplines. Graduates of our program pursue an extraordinary variety of professions and are leaving a legacy in boardrooms, heritage sites, newsrooms, museums, embassies, legislative chambers, galleries, and universities around the world. For example, and this is the reason why we're here tonight, the school has a heritage conservation specialization at the undergraduate and graduate level with practical roots in advocacy, community-based education, social justice, and sustainable planning. These specialized programs have proven themselves as a means for our students to find relevant employment after graduation in a variety of areas, including Parks Canada, Heritage Canada, the Natural History Museum, the Canadian Museum of History, the National Art Gallery, the Canadian War Museum, and the National Capital Commission. In the spring of this year, the school will be hosting its 16th annual Heritage Conservation Symposium. In brief, the school's commitment to heritage conservation is long-standing. For that reason, I approached the School of Architecture at Carleton University, and through them, our co-hosts and co-organizers, Heritage Ottawa and Historic Ottawa Development Incorporated, to organize an event on the fate and future of 24 Sussex. At a time when Canada faces a nationwide housing crisis, homelessness remains an unmet challenge that no level of government alone can address, and Canadians are losing their homes to fire, floods, and tornadoes, a discussion about where our Prime Minister should live may seem unwarranted. Yet, to confront the question we must, in part because 24 Sussex is, for better or worse, part of our national identity and our shared history, even when that history entails occupying and building on unceded territory. Our panel tonight is moderated by Andrew Cohen, who needs no introduction. He's recently retired from Carleton University. He's a colleague of mine from the School of Journalism at Carleton University. He's also a columnist, as you know, for the Globe and Mail and the Ottawa Citizen. He is, like me, a graduate of the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. The panel will consider a range of questions and in the process stimulate debate and discussion. We are fortunate to have secured the foremost leading experts on the subject who will share with us their views from legal, architectural, conservation, and governance perspectives. Our first speaker is the Honourable Sheila, who was first elected to Parliament in 1981, where she spent 10 years in Cabinet as Canada's first woman Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of the Environment, and Minister of Canadian Heritage. Ms. Copps introduced the Historic Places Initiative, groundbreaking legislation that promoted provincial and federal tax incentives to private sector investment in saving historic properties. She is a journalist, political commentator, and author. Our next speaker will be Dr. Patricia Kell. She's the Executive Director of the National Trust for Canada. A senior cultural heritage professional, she has held leadership positions with some of Canada's foremost heritage organizations, including Parks Canada, the Canadian Conservation Institute, and the Canadian Heritage Information Network. Marc Denhez is a lawyer and president of Historic Ottawa Development, Inc. He is a former member of the board of the National Capital Commission, where he served on the Official Residences Committee and the Canadian Renovators Council. He is the author of the book, The Canadian Home, and I've been told that he was also a lecturer in the School of Canadian Studies at one time. So we have a lot to talk about, Marc. And Mark Thompson-Brent, whose illustrations and work you saw in the adjoining room, Woodside Hall, along with those of the students from Israeli School of Architecture, is a founding partner, a conservation architect, and urbanist at Trace Architectures. He has 40 years experience in the field and has written and lectured widely across North America on the reuse of buildings. He co-authored the national document, Building Resilience, Practical Guidelines for the Sustainable Rehabilitation of Buildings in Canada. So without any further delay, I'd like to turn it over to Andrew, who is our moderator for this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Mike is picking this up? Okay. Welcome, everybody. This panel, which has been organized by so many organizations, is called From Residence to Reticence. And I hope none of those here will be reticent. We look forward to a frank and full and focused discussion of views. My job here is to ask questions, keep things moving along, try to give everyone equal time. All questions will be open to all panelists. If you don't want to respond to one of them, if it's not your area of interest or expertise, that's fine. The hope is for a conversation, so if any of you would like to jump in, please do. My instructions are to go till about 8:30 or 8:40, at which time we'll open the floor to questions, some in person, some online. We'll wrap up at about 9 o'clock. Those are my instructions anyway. Just to review how some people see 24 Sussex, we all know the residence is in a state of disrepair. It has been this way for years, and its condition divides us, appalls us, or for some just bores us. The world has taken notice. On November 15, 2018, the New York Times reported from Ottawa about the parlous state of 24 Sussex under the headline, "Justin Trudeau's official home, unfit for a leader or anyone else." Inside, decades of neglect have turned Canada's top political address into its most famous home renovation project. So it's noted there, and my understanding was that this story, which of course ran the New York Times, was at the time the it had the most eyeballs of any story that had come out of Ottawa, which was extraordinary. And in a news-gathering organization of now some 8, 9, or 10 million readers, that's subscribers, that's reaching a lot of people. So it's fair to say that 24 Sussex is on the minds not just of Canadians, but has had some international interest as well, largely people asking just how did this happen? So tonight we'll discuss what 24 Sussex means to Canada, why it's important or not, how it got to this state of collapse, what can be done about it. We'll hear from the experts and whom you've been introduced to, and who I hope will discuss the options, renovate it, rebuild it, raise it, or abandon it. So let's begin with a question for all of you. Why should Canadians care about 24 Sussex? Patricia.
Well, first of all, thanks very much, and it's a real pleasure to be here this evening. I think there are really three main reasons Canadians should care about 24 Sussex. The first is because of its historic and cultural importance, and Catherine did a good job of explaining the deep history of the house, a place substantially built in 1867, the year of Confederation, linked to Parliament from the beginning, and of course since 1950, the official residence of prime ministers. And I think that long history, a fine stone building, which has been designated by the federal government as being an important heritage building, that's the first reason people should care, because there's something culturally important there. I think the second reason people should care is because given the state that the place is in, there is huge potential. There's huge potential to use this place as a demonstration of things that are important to us. And those could be aspects of greening of heritage buildings, of buildings in general, a place to engage towards reconciliation, a place to think about the housing problem. So I think there's a ton of potential. And the third reason I think Canadians should care about the place is because of what it says about how we think about heritage generally, and the sort of broader conclusions we might take about how we think about our past that are demonstrated in the way that we look after 24 Sussex.
Thank you. Sheila.
Patricia has hit the nail on the head when she says, number 3, it's about how we feel about heritage. And we can run around the world talking about how we're going to save the world from climate change, but one of the creators of climate change is overuse and throwing things away. And the fashion industry is responsible, for example, for 10% of the effects of climate change, because the fashion industry expects people to throw their wardrobes out every second year. Canada, we have been blessed with 20% of the world's fresh water and great swaths of land. But in that blessing, it has also been a curse, because it has meant that we have not had to be stewards of our built heritage over a long period of time. If you want to change the channel, you simply go out and get a farmer's field and build another house. Build our houses to last 30 years and we tear them down. The fact that anybody would even ask the question, should 24 Sussex be kept, is, I think, a symbol of the deeper problem in Canada, that we've become very often a throwaway society. And I think that throwaway idea is particularly symbolized when you would ever even conceive of throwing away the Prime Minister's residence.
Marc. We have 2 Marcs, by the way.
Thank you, and it is really a pleasure to be here. I was the inaugural speaker in 2006 at the Phillips Memorial Lecture, so this is a bit of a homecoming for me, and it's wonderful to see so many people here tonight honoring the legacy of Bob and Marianne. I thought that Patricia and Sheila said it all. I would just like to highlight a couple of things that they alluded to. There's something called the wise use of existing resources. It's a fact that responsible citizens and society will use that as a guideline for their lives. It's very important. And it's important for a number of reasons. Certainly for Canadians, it's important that we honor our past and that we show the responsibility of a leading democracy in the world, but also from a personal perspective, it's a great thing to teach your children, and it's a great thing to live your life by. One of those reasons is sustainability, which Patricia mentioned briefly. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later, because I have the list of Andrew's questions. So I know we're going to come to it. But I just want to say that, as Patricia said, what's important to us today, and certainly what's important to us, is to save the planet. We're living in times of a climate emergency. It's going to get much, much worse. It's going to go from climate change to climate chaos pretty much any month or year now. So I think also, as Patricia and Sheila said, it's an opportunity for us to demonstrate Canadian values. And I will talk a little bit more about those particular values.
Marc?
Thank you, Andrew. I must be losing my touch, because I actually totally agree with everything that's just been said. Hody's focus, Historic Ottawa Development, Inc., is on the business case. And here's why we think this topic is of relevance to every Canadian who owns a roof over their head. Canada's building stock was estimated to have a value of $6.7 trillion. But over 5 million dwellings were built over 50 years ago. And out of the housing stock, there is 1.1 million dwellings that have been described as being in need of major repair. They're at risk of falling out of the habitable building stock, the habitable housing stock altogether. So what is the message that 24 Sussex, and I totally agree, this is a question of message. What is the message that 24 Sussex delivers to the general property-owning population of Canada as to what to do with this building stock? And the answer to that question is you let it fall into the ground. It doesn't stop there. I ask myself the question, is the federal government, or at least certain elements of the federal government, and we'll get to that in a moment, saying that Canadians should be scared off fix-up, that Canadians should be scared away from the Canadian renovation industry? If you look at their math, they are estimating that the cost of redoing 24 Sussex comes to $3,300 a square foot and up. That's conservative. Pardon me, it's conservative. I know that sounds like a whole bunch of figures, but just picture this for a moment. You are the proud owner of a 1,500 square foot bungalow. Value, let's say, $400,000. By that math, in order to redo your 1,500 square foot bung, you have to budget $5 million. Okay, think about that for a second. Now, no wonder politicians are daunted. They're getting advice like that. Thing is, our experts say, no, what century are you from? The state of know-how in Canada having to do with renovation is far more advanced than that. And so our message is to say, number one, let's do the homework. Number two, let this be peer reviewed. And number three, we can prove that this can do a hell of a lot better than that. One last word, and that is, in our conversations with the federal government, Hody's been at this for a long time now, the federal government is clearly split right down the middle. We've had inspiring support from some officials, and we've had very determined opposition from others. Back to you, Andrew.
So I'm hearing a lot of different things here: culture, history, money. Marc, you used the word values, and I'd like you to address that. You won't find this question on the list. Sorry. You used the word values, and I'd like to take it beyond that to character and what this says, this whole discussion says about us.
Well, you know, if you think about other countries in the G7, take the UK with 10 Downing Street, take the US with the White House. Could you imagine anyone in those countries saying, just tear the bloody thing down? It's just not even imaginable that those other nations would do that. So why would Canadians do that? Yes, I know we have a sort of long-standing, sort of grumpy attitude towards our leaders, and we tend to downplay the importance of important things, and that's just part of Canadians' DNA. But you don't throw away that which has value. And that doesn't matter whether it's our natural heritage, our cultural heritage. When I think of values, I think of the site that it sits on. Never mind the heritage, the lovely stone heritage building. Think of that site. It sits at the confluence of the Rideau, the Gatineau, and the Ottawa rivers. It's the very raison d'etre that one of our speakers has already talked about, the very raison d'etre for Canada's existence, and certainly the placement of this city in this location, this city of Ottawa-Gatineau. So values are very high on the list.
Okay. Sheila, you of course sat at the cabinet table. You know how people think. You shook your head when Marc said he could not imagine this debate in other places. What's your sense of why this discussion is what it is and where it is now, and that it has gone on so long with no conclusion?
You need to, I think we need to change the way that the NCC actually manages the project in the first place, because right now, the decision to sign off on the renovation of the house belongs to the Prime Minister. So every Prime Minister who comes does not want to take that decision because they don't want to be accused of fattening their own home. So you really need to take it outside and almost put it into something like an electoral commission where the body makes decisions based on architects, based on history and the best use of the house. And I think Marc Denhez drew out some numbers. And if you look at what NCC should have spent over the last 20 years, even just in maintenance, every person who owns a home has to spend 1 or 2% a year on maintaining that home or it falls down around them. Well, that hasn't happened. So I think the biggest problem is that it's a political home and that the solutions for funding it are political, and that most political leaders don't want to damage their own credibility, so they won't put anything on the table to fix the place up. So it's left to the NCC to kind of try and survive for years with very little funding.
Do you have a comment, Patricia?
Yeah, can I jump in on that? Because it seems to me that there's a certain failure of imagination here. So if the fundamental problem, and I think that this is absolutely part of the fundamental problem, is that the decision-making body is not comfortable making the decision, then surely we could concoct a different way of of making those decisions that led to better outcomes. And in fact, it makes me think, Marc, about the comments you were making about the White House and 10 Downing Street. Again, there are buildings, the case of the White House famously white because it was burned in the War of 1812. In the case of 10 Downing Street, a building that was built in the 17th century, somehow American and UK architects and engineers have found ways for those buildings to be functional homes for heads of states in the 21st century. I find it very difficult to believe that we cannot also do that in Canada.
Hear, hear.
So is it historical amnesia? Is it a failure of will? Is it money? Is it money? In a $2 trillion economy? 40, 50, 60, 70 million dollars, and we're tearing ourselves apart over that?
There's more to it than that. That is, just picture for a moment the poor benighted minister who is dealing with this thing, and they have a certain wing of the federal government that are saying, wouldn't it be just tickety-boo if we move the prime minister out of there and find another nicer place for the prime minister to live? Maybe if it's not across the street, maybe in Rockcliffe Park. There's some nice houses in Rockcliffe Park. And so it goes. The only problem with that is that the address at number 24 is written into the Official Residences Act. You can't change definitively the home of the Prime Minister of Canada without an act of Parliament. And who wants to be the minister to stand up in the House of Commons and say, hi everybody, I want to reopen the Official Residences Act? And you wonder why it's taken decades to reach a decision. Okay? So that is part of the political stalemate that has been bred in this country. And I have to totally agree with Patricia's comment. Maybe there are other ways of coming to a decision.
So, Marc, you anticipated or saw the next question. So, the legislative and regulatory framework in which this is set, what is the context, legal and otherwise, for this conversation? You've already mentioned the Official Residences Act. Does that constrain anything that can be done here,
Assuming
or require?
that anybody pays any attention to the law,
Okay.
which is a big assumption.
Well, can you explain to people what is in there and how it affects 24 Sussex?
First of all, number one, we have encountered nobody, I repeat, nobody in the government who is saying, let's call in the bulldozers. That's a good sign, okay? We have, however, encountered some actually other signs that are very positive, and that is only 3 weeks ago, the National Capital Commission was able to announce they finally booted out the dead rodents, and they booted out the asbestos, and they booted out the bad wiring. Yeah, that's another good sign. But the thing is that nobody ever expected that the bulldozers were the main risk. Not a decision to that effect anyway. The main risk is no decision at all. Because if you just keep kicking the can down the road year after year after year, the poor thing's going to fall down. It's called demolition by neglect, and that has been since day one the largest threat facing this property for decades. So you look at the Official Residences Act, it's black and white, ladies and gentlemen. It's right there on the printed page. There is a statutory obligation to maintain, to repair, and even, oh my goodness, to upgrade where appropriate. Okay, it's in the Act. Well, we know how much respect that got. Now, let's turn instead to the Federal Sustainable Development Act.
Can I just jump in for a second, Marc?
Defines, and I quote, sustainability means the capacity of a thing to be maintained indefinitely. Okay, right there. Parliament of Canada has spoken. Well, we know how much attention that got. And then there's, of course, procedures. If you're in bureaucracy, and I've been in bureaucracy long enough to know this, there are always procedures. And the procedure was specified in a manual which said, David, that yes, 4% of a building's replacement value should be budgeted every year for A, maintenance, and B, periodic upgrades. Well, we know how much attention that got paid. So the question is,
Marc, can I just
now
jump
do we
in
move?
for a second?
Nobody is too keen about standing up in the House of Commons saying we should move. Thing is, Historic Ottawa Development Inc. doesn't take a position on whether the ultimate purpose of that building is to be the residence of a prime minister. We're quite content to say that's a federal decision. Let the federal government make that decision for now and for the future. But there's a catch. And that is, if you want to amend the Official Residences Act, can you picture trying to get something A, onto the order paper, B, through 3 readings in Parliament, and do all of the various rigmarole that's necessary in time for the next election? Okay, so that's the catch, because there is a distinct risk that if you decide you're going to go that route, you wind up with A, further delay, and B, whenever you look at delay, you're talking about further deterioration. So that's your legislative context.
Okay, Marc, I'm going to ask others as well. We have managed to restore or at least maintain other official residences. Rideau Hall there have been a number of projects. Maybe they weren't done the way you'd like them to be done, but they were. Stornoway, where the Leader of the Opposition lives, has had a number, I believe, of renovations. So what is it about 24 Sussex? Is it because it's the marquee residence here? Patricia?
That would be my interpretation, really. That, as Sheila said, that the problem is the optics of a prime minister investing in the house that he himself lives in. I would say that...
although the Act compels it.
The Act compels it.
So it's not even the Prime Minister's choice.
Well, theoretically, it's not. And we were having a discussion before the panel started about whether someone should be suing the government for non-performance
now we're getting somewhere.
Under that Act.
Okay. Sheila, would you want to get in on this? And we have an Act. It demands...
Well, you were asking Marc about why a minister doesn't want to come forward. If you have to bring in a piece of legislation that is voted on by all members of Parliament, which you will have to have because it's a building that is listed and would have to be delisted, then you'd actually have to have all the parties on side, and that would be an absolute chaotic mess, a hot mess, which is why none of the ministers would want to bring forward such a piece of legislation. So the conundrum is, if you don't want to keep the place, you have to legislate your way out of it. And if you do want to keep the place, the guy or woman who's living in it is the one who has to say yes to the spending. So it is an impossible situation. And Patricia mentioned the idea of taking it outside. I think a foundation, which is arm's length from the government, should be mandated to manage all of these things in the same way that we did with elections. No party touches elections legislation. It's all run by outside people who are impartial. And I think you should do the same thing, because even though the NCC runs the official residences piece, they answer to a minister. In a sense, they're part of the political process. So it's hard to get away from that. And it always ends up back on the Prime Minister's desk, and it always sits there. Even Mr. Chrétien, who did say publicly recently that it was an embarrassment for Canada to be in this situation, said when he was given the chance, he didn't do anything either, because he didn't want to be the one to say, well, I'm spending money on, my couch or my curtains or whatever. And that's what happens.
He had 3 majority governments and 10 years in office.
Yes.
He could have done something, and this Prime Minister could have done something too.
Well, but that's why he had 3 majority governments.
Okay.
That's the reality of it. It's not a popular thing. And I actually went to my buddies and friends around Hamilton and just asked people. Most people are not engaged. And so that's the problem. They're not engaged. And the bottom line is, if they are engaged, usually they're against it. It's not politically popular.
Okay, I want to go to Marc, Brent.
In fact, I was going to pick up on that very point. Nobody really cares about these things that we're talking about, the legislation, the this, the that, the act. The average person is simply saying, look, if it needs fixing, let's just fix it. And if it's beyond repair, let's move on from it, okay? It is not about to fall down, okay? The structural reports indicate some problem areas. It is not about to fall down. And a rat in the basement, well, we live in the country and we caught 34, or well, our cats caught 34 mice last winter. So, you know, it's not a big deal. It's something that you just deal with. So my thinking on the whole legislative piece is get it away from the politicians, get it with a professional group that knows how to do these things, and get on with it.
So, and this is certainly not original to this conversation, but a nonpartisan commission of some type of eminent Canadians removed from politics, examining this and coming to a decision and making a recommendation to the Government of Canada. Would that be so hard to do?
It's set up for that already, right? Like the NCC is a Crown Corp, so it's partially removed, just like the National Trust is removed from government.
Completely removed.
And completely removed, so maybe another further step away. But the Act, as Marc has pointed out, is clear that they must maintain, they must upgrade as necessary. So it's already there, but it's about the optics, which was a word that Patricia just used. It's everything is optics. In today's world, it's all about optics. It's what's the 15-second clip that you can have come in on your laptop? It's whatever. It's all about optics. So even though it's set up to be out of the hands of the politicians, the person on the street thinks, oh, Trudeau's feathering his own nest. It's not that way.
Although ironically, he's not living there.
Yeah, exactly, right?
And has no intention of living there.
It was the best opportunity we've had.
It was.
In 70 years.
It was.
And it's been frittered away, and now, you know, next year there'll be an election. So, you know, and we'll be back right in the heart of the problematic piece of the optics.
So, but the other piece that could have been helpful here is the status of this building as a heritage building. So it has status under the Official Residences Act, but it also has status under the Treasury Board policy as a federal heritage building, a classified federal heritage building.
The highest level.
The highest
the
level.
The same level as the Parliament buildings.
Exactly. So why is that not helping us with this situation? And the answer is because the Treasury Board policy doesn't actually have any positive obligations to care for the places that are important heritage places. It has some procedural requirements in terms of review, but it makes no obligations on custodial departments or the departments that are looking after these places to actually care for them. And there's currently a piece of legislation before Parliament, a bill, C-23, which seeks to take some of those protections and actually put them into legislation to give them more teeth than they have now. That bill has been at second reading for 12 months now without making any progress in the House, which I think is a further demonstration of the sort of lack of interest or respect in heritage issues.
Right.
There's
Marc?
another point here as well, and that is, I think Patricia raises an absolutely key point, which is, again, my favorite subject, the subject of filthy lucre. Okay, you can have, I mean, I'm a lawyer, so I figure, oh, well, what's in the statute is in the statute, right? Okay, no. You can have as many statutory obligations as you want, but what do you do if some bean counter in the central agencies says, I'm vetoing your budget? When I was on the board of the National Capital Commission and we were at the Official Residences Committee and we were looking at Rideau Hall, we were in a continuous horse race to see whether we could find a way of getting the budget to do repairs on pieces of Rideau Hall before they were condemned. Okay. Now, until that problem is solved, we ain't gotten nowhere.
So there are a number of people who, curiously, say there's no history here. Curiously, because only, 9 prime ministers have lived there, and it's been an official residence since 1951. But there are people who argue, well, already some of the more material historical artifacts have been removed or have come down in the house, and it has no history, therefore we can raise it. Patricia, you're in the business of history and preservation. Is there any truth to that argument?
I don't think there's truth to that at all. So usually when we talk about heritage, we talk about tangible and intangible. And so the intangible is the story that goes with that place, which is absolutely intact and which indeed spans, whatever it is, 65 years of Canadian history, 65 years of leadership. Previous homes of prime ministers, so the places that were prime ministers' homes before 24 Sussex became the official residence, have been set aside and function as museums and places to tell those stories, except for Earnscliffe, which of course continues to to play a political function. And so I think the place and the building that is in that place has a story to tell, has multiple stories to tell, and those are absolutely intact. And that building, which admittedly heavily changed over the years, which in fact is part of the story in itself, is a vehicle for testifying to that story, that rich story that's part of Canada's history.
Let me ask you about the setting, because recently we've heard a whole security argument that the setting where 24 Sussex is no longer a sustainable, safe place. Is there something, leaving that aside, other than the fact that indeed the house has been there for 70 years, is there something about that setting particularly that makes it a place we want to ensure the Prime Minister lives there? Marc.
So just before I get on to the setting, and I'm really glad you're asking me about it because I think it's a really important aspect, but just to finish that last point, the house was built in '56 and officially occupied in 1867. So it's over 150 years old, okay? It'd been an official residence. It was converted in '49, and they made the official declaration in '51, like you said. So there's already 3/4 of a century, just as the Prime Minister's residence. But there is already, prior to that, a century of existence. And as Patricia says, and I love to say this all the time, those of us who deal with built heritage, we like to say that the story of the building over time is part of its heritage. Just like the story of the setting over time is part of its heritage, which I will get to, I promise, Andrew. And so it started out as a sort of Gothic revival, manor house. When the next lumber baron bought it, they changed it to a chateau-esque style. And then when the government expropriated it, they made it very sort of almost militaristic feeling. It was post-war years. They thought that it had to be very staid for a prime minister's official residence. So they took a lot of the bells and whistles off of it, kept it, and then added to it. That story is quite interesting. And if we're going to rehabilitate it and perhaps add to it, and I'll get to that in a minute, we want to look at those steps, those stages, and tell that story while creating a new layer or a new chapter in its story. So let's apply that now to the setting. The setting at the confluence of these rivers is a sacred place to Indigenous nations. It wasn't just the Anishinaabe, those that were most local for the longest period of centuries, but many nations gathered for meetings here, and they're finding out more and more the archaeology at the confluence of the rivers and around the falls and everything else is only been, the surface has only been scratched. There will be more that comes forward on that. Move forward to the post-European colonization, and the place became absolutely the place of growth in industry for a new nation coming into the world. And so you had at the Rideau Falls, which is almost next door, and at the Chaudière Falls, which is just a stone's throw down the river, you had all of this industry and all of this activity. And today, the sort of post-industrial period, we value views and recreation, and there is not a better view in the nation's capital, and there are some whopper great views in the nation's capital, but there's not a better one than if you walk into the backyard, the north side of that setting, and look out at this wonderful confluence of rivers, and you'll see people active on the river, you'll see things going on, and most of all, you'll see this incredible natural heritage that is at the cradle of our country's founding, the Gatineau Hills in the distance, and it all comes together. The setting is absolutely incredible. It's second to none. It's a much more meaningful setting than Rideau Hall, Governor General's residence, which is lovely, but it's sort of tucked away. It doesn't have the command of a big escarpment overlooking the mighty Ottawa River, a Canadian heritage river. So the setting to me is as important as the building, perhaps more. And I know that you're going to talk a little bit more about the security. This was my point to say, because it's so wrapped up in the setting, Andrew, is that our firm has done a lot of work on Parliament Hill in the last 25 years. And we have, of course, the last 25 years, post 9/11, post October 22nd, security on Parliament Hill is second to none. It trumps heritage, it trumps everything. And we have made those buildings that you can literally walk beside on the sidewalk. You can walk beside these buildings. And we have managed, the teams of consultants, engineers, security people that work on these projects have made them safe. So the Prime Minister's residence is walled off. There's an escarpment on the north side. It's as safe, actually much safer than many other buildings that parliamentarians work in every single day. So I think this whole security thing is a red herring.
So I'm pleased to hear you say that, because we hear more and more about this, and it wasn't part of the debate before. Right now we hear drones may do something unpleasant, or all kinds of things that would expose the Prime Minister to harm and his family. But you're saying that's not so. Does anyone challenge Marc on that, or do we?
Absolutely not. Marc has a point. Okay, security was reviewed in 1998. Not ideal, not perfect, but manageable. It was reviewed again in 2008. Not perfect, but manageable. Suddenly, we have a consultant's report, okay, where they farm it out to somebody who's going to come in and give a report to unnamed officials, and suddenly, my goodness, it's suddenly become a fatal consideration. Now, the things that confuse me about that, number one, it's actually less exposed than the parliamentarians are in the West Block. It's less exposed than the cabinet is, and the cabinet offices at PCO at the corner of Elgin and Wellington. And as far as street exposure is concerned, and that was always the major concern. As far as street exposure is concerned, there have been a whole series of installations that have gone in the last number of years, so that it is actually more secure now than it was when it passed the tests in 2008 and 1998. So the question is, where does all of this come from? And our security advisors tell us the question isn't whether it's perfect. If we wanted perfect, we would put the Prime Minister at the bottom of the Diefenbunker.
Yes, we would move him to Canada.
Careful about that, Andrew.
And drones can go anywhere.
And,
Even Canada.
And the thing is, the question isn't whether it's perfect. The question is whether A, it's manageable, and B, it's competitive. What are the alternatives? Because the question of drones, and I have to tell you, I mean, that is the big variable in the last number of years. And a place called the Ukraine taught us that. Okay, so there are legitimate questions that have to be asked from the standpoint of security, but we are being told, and we believe it, that the security at 24 Sussex is competitive with all the known alternatives.
Okay. Sheila, any comment on security and the setting?
Well, I think the fact that it is across from the GG's and beside the Rideau Cottage also lends itself to kind of a security perimeter. So in the initial discussions, we heard about the possibility of the residents moving to a park in the neighborhood. You'd have to start that whole security process all over again. And it's my experience, obviously, in politics when it comes to either the military or the RCMP. They were asked to provide a document of cost. They outsourced it, and they're going to come in with a number that's probably double or triple of what it actually costs. That's pretty standard.
So were this panel deciding, and I'm assuming Patricia agrees, were this panel deciding, the first thing we could take off the table is moving this. I mean, if we would either raise it or rebuild it, renovate it, but we wouldn't leave the site. That would seem to be the recommendation where this panel advising the Government of Canada, you would say the security argument is a canard.
As I said, Historic Ottawa Development Inc. doesn't take a philosophical position on that. Our position is strictly pragmatic, and that is you can't get the legislation in time.
Okay. Let's move on to money and the cost of rehabilitating versus starting anew. Who would like to go first on this? Patricia?
Sure. I'm the hand-waving person here, so my colleagues will be able to talk in more detail. I think that the financial estimates that we have seen are complete. Well, I don't know. I haven't seen made public how they arrived at those numbers. And I ask myself, what proportion of those numbers is going to be required regardless of where the Prime Minister lives, and what is specific to this site? And I further think to myself, very often when people are doing work in a heritage space, that the financial risk, if you like, is related to the uncertainty. You don't know what's behind that wall. You're not sure what the wiring's like in the basement. In this case, the house has recently been torn back to the studs. There is no mystery. We know exactly what is there. And so all of that uncertainty around working in a heritage space is gone. So my sense is that we do not have a real number for what it would cost to rehabilitate the house from where it is today, nor do we have a real cost for doing anything else on the site, because there is no other plan to do something on the site. So we really don't have enough information even to make an informed decision.
So the numbers we're seeing and have been seeing for a decade or so are really not credible, or?
Yeah, I don't think that, well, they're certainly not current, and I don't think they're credible.
Marc is dying to get in on this
I am
one.
dying to get in.
I know you are.
Okay. There are some people I know who divide the world between missionaries and mercenaries. 3 guesses who we are. Bottom line on that one. Money was studied in 1998, price tag under $3 million. Money was studied in 2008, price tag somewhere close to $10 million. Last year, on the tube, we see this nice official standing in front of 24 Sussex, waving a document in the air saying, we have a report saying it's now going to cost $37 million. Okay, now we know prices went up. They did go up that much. So here is how it happened. How do you go from $3 million to having a price tag which is 5 times, count it, 5 times the cost per square foot of the highest brand new hospital? How is it possible to do that? Well, here's how you do it. First thing you do is there's this thing that's normally called prep. Okay, now, as-built drawings to tell you what it is that you're dealing with, building condition report, data that tells you what's repairable and what's not. Well, it appears that unnamed officials decided that they could skip all of that prep. I just pause there for a second and see what's going to happen next. Because then they send the estimators through. And the estimators have formal instructions that where you have no data, you must, as a matter of the template that's provided to you by the government, use replacement cost. Now, I invite you to consider for a moment what's involved in repairing a floor as opposed to what's involved in starting over from scratch. Okay. And so what you wind up with at the end of the day, and this time we asked them, show us that report that you were waving in front of the TV cameras. Nope, can't do that. That's a state secret. Okay, so a few trips to the Information Commissioner later, we get a letter saying, well, we can't show you the report because no such report actually exists. Okay, so question is, our experts are absolutely confident that we can shave millions of dollars off that estimate. Because for starters, if you tally up, and we found this in another report, if you tally up all the allowances for unknowns and contingencies and soft costs, you have a total of 70%. That's how you reach a total of $37 million.
That was 70, 7-0.
7-0. Okay, so can we tell you what it's going to cost? Well, we haven't seen the prep. So I can't tell you any better than anybody else can what the actual price is going to be. But we are confident that we can bring it far closer to what Canadians expect on a property like this.
Okay. Marc.
Good conservation practice. It's a classified federal heritage building. They should have done a set of as-found drawings that describes it accurately so that these estimators that Marc talked about can do accurate estimates on takeoffs for materials that have to be replaced or repair areas that have to be repaired. Tests and investigations is our, as heritage conservation architects, it's our biggest bugaboo because none of our clients, particularly our federal clients, want to spend money up front. They're going to get a package of money from the Treasury Board later, so they just want to spend enough to pay the architects enough to get the drawings done. But in conservation work, we can't do the drawings properly. We can't specify what needs to be done without all of the what we call TIMs, tests, investigations, and mock-ups. So if you aren't doing that ahead of time as part of your regular maintenance and regular upgrade that Marc's been talking about, you're not conserving your historic place. So if it's got a classified federal heritage building designation, why isn't that being done? I suspect
It gets skipped.
that the politicians are saying, just like this mystery official that Marc was talking about, that when the politicians say, don't even touch it, they're not saying, I don't want to live there, I don't want the optics of seeing to be spending money there. Don't even do any tests and investigations. This program that the NCC just recently completed that Marc was referring to is the first test and investigation work in I don't know how long, probably ever. So yeah, you can't do an accurate cost estimate without what Marc calls prep, what I call test investigations. You can't do it without accurate drawings of the existing place. Those two things you absolutely have to have. And if you're doing an estimate without those, it's garbage. I'm not going to look at it.
So we have actually no reliable figures now, essentially, is what you're saying.
I'm saying exactly that.
Because the processes have all been illegitimate, the way this has been handled.
And it is, as I said at the outset, the federal government itself is split right down the middle. I met one bureaucratic VIP who is a self-avowed klutz. And this klutz said to me, Marc, if somebody gave me $37 million, I could do that building. Okay, so yes, that answers your question.
Is this debate has been hijacked by the whole sense that it will cost far more than we believe it will, that we cannot even talk about numbers that in other places, you mentioned the White House of the United States, you mentioned 10 Downing Street. Imagine the French having this conversation over the Élysée Palace or the Italians. Is there a figure beyond which we cannot go, or is it possible to go to Canadians, say we had this bipartisan commission that I mentioned earlier, and we had independent recommendations, and we said to them, this could be a reflection, either a renovation or something different than that, of the best we can be architecturally and sustainability and aesthetically. Are we afraid to do that and even talk about a figure that would lead us to that place?
We are, because we haven't done an essential first step. And the first step is to understand, okay, I mean, I can well understand here, some politician looking at this saying, do I really want to spend a whole lot of taxpayer money on making some politico's mansion more cushy? Okay, that's the way it's portrayed. Of course it is.
Some politico is the Democratic elected Prime Minister of Canada.
Yeah, we'll forget all that. Okay. Thing is,
Okay.
according to the National Capital Commission, the part of the building that is living quarters for the Prime Minister and his or her family, 20%. It's about 2,400 square feet. Okay. My house is 2,400 square feet. How many of you people here live in a place that's 2,400 square feet? The description as a mansion misrepresents the situation because the other 80% of the building, at least according to the National Capital Commission, is for governmental functions. Okay, that's the first thing that has to be cleared up. The people of Canada have to be capable of understanding that this is not about taking a politician's mansion and, as Marc said, feathering its nest.
Yeah, I mean, this is, Andrew, this is why in our proposal, and I'm sure others, we said, let's let the house be what it wants to be. It wants to be a single-family home. Just restore it, rehabilitate it, make it net zero, apply good conservation practice. By the way, the standards guidelines for the conservation of historic places in Canada, the very, very first rule is understand your historic place. So if you're not going in and measuring it to the nth degree and you're not doing any tests and investigations, you're flying in the face of the very first step of good conservation practice in Canada. So if you don't make it be what it can't really be without a lot of effort, just allow it to be a single family home. Build all that other 80% that Marc referenced as a separate wing, compatible with the existing building and the existing site.
But on the site, I mean.
But on the site, if you look in Woodside Hall on your way out, you'll see that we've got the same old tunnel from the basement that currently goes
to the swimming pool.
To the swimming pool. We disassemble the swimming pool. We reuse those materials. We keep the tunnel. It goes into the basement now of the new, what we call the official wing. You can call it what you want. And that official wing can represent, as Patricia said, what back to the values question, what do we find important today? So we have a healing circle at the entry. We have opportunities for receptions. We have the Prime Minister's home office, which he doesn't have to go outside to walk from his single family home over to the other place. It does all the things that we want to do. It can be net carbon positive. It can do all the things that we find important today. and be compatible with the historic place.
So Marc has introduced us. Thank you, Marc, for that. And you should see the sketch. Is that the term, or it's really something in the other room. So that opens us to. I'd like to ask each of you, beginning with Sheila, what would you, if we could dream a bit, and money was not the object we think it is. What would we build there, and what would we do? I'm going to start with Sheila and then ask the other two. Marc has already said how he would create something there. Sheila?
Well, I think the other thing is the idea that it's just a single family home. It's not. I mean, the whole first floor has been utilized. I've attended dinners there. In fact, the National Trust came from an idea from King Charles at a dinner that we had at 24 Sussex, because he was very interested in heritage issues. He was also very interested in Indigenous issues, and we were trying to figure out how to get Canadians interested in heritage, because they're just not. So I don't want to speak to building out or building this or building that, because I'm not an architect. I'm saying the vast majority of that house on the main floor is used for a public purpose. And there is a second floor, which is for the private, for the family. Madame Chrétien, remember the famous Inuit sculpture? I mean, you talk about security. There's a little story behind that, which I will just throw in right now. And that is the reason that there was no security on that one was because in those days, the RCMP technology was so bad, it kept getting triggered by squirrels and raccoons. So they just decided to turn it off. And that's why there was no security on that particular day. But my point is, there's a public space and a private space. Of course, we can do other things with the pool or other things. I'd like to see the place restored to its former use as a private public residence where you do both functions. And I think it's tough for the family. If you get right down to the business of it, it must be hard to live in a house and also have the public space, which is probably why Marc's proposal of building it out would sort of give a bit more privacy. But in the current iteration, the dining room is often used for official events. The living room is often used for official events. Key people from the world, from Nelson Mandela to Bill Clinton to Gorbachev. These are the people who visited there. And it's all part of the public record. And why would we even think of getting rid of that? It just makes no sense. So I didn't answer your question, Andrew, but I'm sorry, because I don't think beyond it. I think, well, let's take it and make it work properly. And bearing in mind the biggest issue at the Glasgow COP28, I think, was the fact that torn buildings and destroyed buildings and rotten concrete are one of the biggest factors contributing to climate change. So why would we lead the parade on destroying something that could actually be refurbed and renewed and restored and renovated and rejoiced about?
Okay. Patricia.
So I agree with these. In a way, I work at this question backwards about, what do I think would not be the right outcome? I think tearing down the house would be the wrong outcome. So if the option is, move the Prime Minister somewhere else and use the house for something else, for a different purpose, then we should move the Prime Minister. But, and partly I think that for exactly the reasons Sheila was just saying, that the notion that we would take our largest consumer objects, which is say a building, and simply dispose of it because it's challenging, I find really offensive. So I do think there's huge potential. I think Marc's examined some of that potential to build a place that we could all be proud of, that could fulfill the functions that it needs to fulfill. That is probably a combination of what has been there and what will be there. So a modern layer on a historic place, which is a perfectly acceptable intervention based on the standards and guidelines in order to achieve the needs that we have now. I think, heritage conservation is, I think, not what many people think of it as being. It is not about sort of slavishly preserving what has been there. It is about finding ways to use historic places to meet modern needs and to address current issues. And I think that this place could be such a wonderful demonstration of that in so many ways for Canadians.
Yeah, we call it managing change.
I'm going to follow suit, and that is that Hody doesn't take a philosophical position on what is the perfect ultimate use of that building. And we can anticipate a number of alternatives, but the one thing that is common to all of the alternatives is, number one, there has to be a basic amount of research and prep that is done, as Marc pointed out. Number two, it should be possible in principle to walk and chew gum at the same time. It should be possible in principle to come up with good ideas. I look out at this audience. There are many experts I recognize in this room right now. Canada does have the expertise to deal with issues like this. And I'm absolutely confident that we can deal with it more efficiently than we've seen so far. So there are two things that are at the top of our agenda. Number one, let's make a commitment. Stop kicking it down the road. Make a commitment now. And number two, we do the prep in such a way that we're capable of pivoting. If the government ultimately decides it is going to view the uses in one particular perspective, that we anticipate that, but we should also be capable of anticipating alternatives. If they decide to move in a different direction, there are still very valuable things that we can do that will benefit all taxpayers. That's Hody's position.
Okay, so I'm taking from here what it's all of you, every one of you wants to renew, rebuild, rehabilitate. That's the economic and environmental. Let me ask you, though, there are many architects, we've heard from them, who say the opposite. They are architects, they like to design things, they like to design new things that are shiny, and you will read many pieces of commentary about raising 24 Sussex and building something reflecting 21st century Canada in all its diversity, with an Indigenous element present in a way that maybe not there now. What is the argument? Could any of you imagine that? Could any of you think about that in a way that maybe that would be a defensible argument?
Andrew, if they decide to build a new glass box, perhaps something that Walter Gropius would have cooked up in 1928.
Well, how about Frank Gehry? He's Canadian.
Okay, let's suppose, and they're going to parachute that into Rockcliffe Park. If their maintenance standards are no better than at 24 Sussex, how long do you think it's going to take for Mickey and his friends to find their way into those walls?
Okay, others, could we contemplate, for the sake
Andrew,
of
can I just say,
argument, could we contemplate a new building entirely there that could be maintained? Patricia?
Well, could we? We probably could.
Well, it's part of this discussion, though. It is part of the conversation.
I get my problem about taking down the building that's there, apart from the heritage value.
Nobody's suggesting that.
Is the symbolic weight of removing something that is there, that has value, that is the result of an expense of effort and energy and carbon, and which is functional and usable, but which, for reasons of ego, must come down in order to exclusively express a modern sensibility on a site which, as Marc really beautifully described, has many layers of history on it. Can I imagine it happening? Yes, I can. Can I justify in any way that is the preferred course of action? No, I can't.
And Marc, I'm assuming you feel, well, I know you feel differently, although you are, you're talking about adaptability and a certain level of creativity with what we have there now. You're not just saying rebuild it as it was, you're talking about adding a wing or
Yeah, I'm talking about, in a full agreement with Patricia and Marc, that what's there has value. It has value, wait till I start talking about the carbon, but it has value environmentally, it has value economically, it has value socioculturally. Why wouldn't you just fix it? And then, because in the 21st century, a prime minister's role has expanded and changed significantly since 1949, when this decision was first made, accommodate that. It doesn't have to be accommodated within the 4 stone walls of the existing building. There's a nice big site there, and frankly, when they're having cabinet meetings with all of the bureaucrats around, and when they're having VIP meetings or G7 meetings, whatever, and all of the bureaucrats are there, they need all of the contemporary infrastructure to handle that. So a new facility makes sense, but it also allows the building to be what it is. Sheila talked about, yes, well, the building, you know, it was a mansion, and so a lot of the ground floor is that sort of semi-public area, but Sheila also admitted that that puts out the family. So let the family have the space, let them invite who they want in, let the business of the country happen right next door, right on the same property, and if you've got, I don't like to go to the ego place, but it does give a chance for a contemporary chapter in the story to have a place at the table, but not for the reasons of ego or just because you want to express, you know, the 2020s, but because you recognize that the requirements that government now puts on a prime minister's residence are such that they have changed in the 75 years that it first became a prime ministerial residence. So accept these things and design for those things. That's going to be the most efficient, the most culturally responsible, the most environmentally responsible way to go. So to me, all the puzzle pieces come together.
Sorry.
All right, so that is the feeling of the panel. All
I'd
I
like
would
to
say
jump
is
in,
that,
Andrew.
and I would agree with all of what you're saying.
Andrew.
I think we should stay with this building. I would also say there is a constituency out there which would say, we built an embassy in Washington, we built a new one in Berlin, we have designed museums. They are now considered, some of these, iconic, and there is a constituency that would argue in the first third of the first quarter of the 21st century, Canada is more than able to come up with an environmentally sustainable and aesthetically pleasing and an economically reassuring residence for the Prime Minister. I don't agree with it, but there is a constituency that feels that way, and were we to have another panelist here, it would be interesting to hear what he or she would say.
That's entirely possible, but I am
Can I
comforted
just
by
jump
the
in,
fact
if it's
that
possible?
although there
Can
are
I
some
jump in
people
on
within
this?
the federal government who are pushing very hard to oppose any move on 24 Sussex for an assortment of reasons. They do not want to see a decision reached on that building. Yeah. But there are at least as many people within the federal government who say the opposite, who have been energetically supporting every step that we have taken along the way. And we have been assured that there is absolutely no one in the federal government who's actually pushing for an announced decision that we're tearing the sucker down.
Okay. Sheila, do you want to have the last word on
Andrew,
this?
Yes. Well, I want to spread it out because the idea that somehow we should use 24 Sussex as the Frank Gehry of the 21st century, Public Works is the biggest landlord in the country. And do you see what they build across the country?
Particularly in Ottawa.
It's mostly not that interesting. And a little known fact, Jean Chrétien did not want to be a lawyer. He wanted to be an architect. And his father kind of forced him to be a lawyer because he said architects don't really have a future. So anyway, he invited Frank Gehry, and he was actually looking at doing a Frank Gehry Museum at the Science and Technology Building, which is now the apartments down on the Breton Flats. There was another opportunity to do something fantastic. So there's lots of opportunities to do modern, fantastic architecture, including Douglas Cardinal, the first Indigenous architect who did the Canadian Embassy in Washington. But 24 Sussex is not the place to tear everything down and start from scratch. There's lots of other places around the country. And I think if somebody who believes in architecture should get the Treasury Board to pass a resolution that no public works can be built in Canada without having a minimum architectural value, because they're the ones that drove half of the people out of the downtown cores. They closed down all those glorious post offices. They closed down all those glorious courthouses and stuck people out in strip malls. So that's the bigger issue, where they can do that work. But please don't use 24 Sussex as your guinea pig for that one, because this place needs to be saved as a symbol of the fact that we value history.
Hear, hear. Okay.